Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our discussion on Azure Virtual WAN with a relatively high-level discussion on how to integrate Virtual WAN with the first-party Azure Firewall service and different third-party network virtual appliance products. In this lesson, we'll start off with the high-level overview on how Virtual WAN integrates with network virtual appliances, and then talk about our two main groupings of products, starting with the Hub Network Virtual Appliance Interface, which is mostly focusing on third-party SD-WAN implementations. And then we're going to talk about integrating our virtual hub with different security products, including the first-party Azure Firewall product and other third-party security appliance products as well. So jumping on into it, as a quick reminder, we've previously learned that a virtual hub within Azure Virtual WAN is simply a managed network that acts as a hub for a typical hub-and-spoke topology. So going back earlier in this course, we learned that hub networks using hub-and-spoke topology is a really great place to create a centralized network virtual appliance or Azure Firewall appliance because it acts as the center point that all your other spoke traffic goes through. And this is really no exception except for the fact that it's a lot more managed. However, since this is a managed network, we cannot simply deploy a virtual machine into our virtual hub like we could with a regular non-managed virtual net. Rather, the Virtual WAN interface provides some easy deploy solutions to deploy directly into our virtual hub that is a bit of a different process from our typical virtual machine deployment process. Now, as I mentioned, we're talking about both the first-party Azure Firewall product and third-party products. When we're talking about third-party products, we are specifically referring to a select group of partners that Azure has partnered with, of which the two main categories are SD-WAN products that extend your existing SD-WAN implementation, and a few different firewall and security products that have a different interface that can be deployed along the first-party Azure Firewall service. Not surprisingly, deploying virtual appliances into a virtual WAN has a number of benefits, which include being overall pretty easy to deploy. They are highly available by default in that they are availability zone aware, and routing is a relatively simplified process in which you merely need to implement your virtual appliance routes alongside your virtual hub route tables like we talked about in a previous lesson in this section. Moving on, I want to talk about our two main categories of virtual appliances and the differences in interface and implementation, starting with our SD-WAN Hub NVA implementation. When deploying SD-WAN virtual appliances, these are going to be deployed from the settings of our individual virtual hub, specifically underneath the third-party providers link that you see on the right side there. We're going to go in through the network virtual appliance interface. Again, we are specifically talking about SD-WAN products such as those from VMware, Cisco, and a few other vendors as well. When it comes to implementation, though, the process is a little bit different for each individual company's product, so it is kind of hard to speak onto the specific implementation process. Overall, what we are generally looking at is when we deploy one of these products, we need to first enter our vendor account information, such as our account info, authentication, license information, etc., from which we will then be taken to the Azure Marketplace interface, specifically the marketplace that can deploy that product directly into our virtual hub, kind of what you see there with the VMware example. One very key point I need to highlight when talking about SD-WAN products is that we are working with scale units yet again. In other words, when deploying your SD-WAN virtual appliance, you need to assign a scale unit, which, like our VPN examples, measures the aggregate throughput for that virtual appliance. And of course, more scale units cost more money. However, when working with SD-WAN virtual appliances, each individual scale unit is equivalent to 500 megabits per second of aggregate throughput, exactly the same as our VPN scale unit we talked about earlier. Next, let's shift our focus to the other main virtual appliance product, which is going to be security appliances, and this is specifically referring to both Azure Firewall and third-party security products as well, which also has a bit of a different interface. Specifically on the right side, we are deploying it through the Azure Firewall and Firewall Manager interface. With this implementation, we can choose between the first-party Azure Firewall product and or a number of third-party providers that Microsoft has specifically partnered with that you can see below. At the moment, the only three partners are Zscaler, Checkpoint, and iBoss. Of course, this list may change over time. However, the main takeaway that you need to know for now for the scope of this course is that when working with a third-party security provider product, that we're going to deploy into our virtual hub, that does require deploying a network gateway to that virtual hub, which will be automatically created in the same process of deploying the actual product as well. With that, that'll wrap up this high-level conceptual overview of the ins and outs of deploying third-party virtual appliances to a virtual WAN virtual hub. Let's go ahead and review our key takeaways before we move on. We started off with a quick reminder that a network hub is a really great place for a centralized virtual appliance, and when working with virtual WANs, it's really easy to deploy it and integrate with our virtual WAN setup. We also covered the fact that we cannot simply deploy normal virtual machines into our virtual hub. We got to go through the managed interface instead. From an implementation perspective, when working with both SD-WAN and security products, we deploy these from the virtual hub settings. From the SD-WAN virtual appliance perspective, we need to assign one or more scale units to our individual products, in which a scale unit is 500 megabits per second of aggregate throughput. And we also covered that when working with third-party security products, not SD-WAN products, that requires a network gateway to be deployed to our virtual hub as well. That's going to go ahead and wrap this lesson up. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.